Good morning, everyone. Welcome to my podcast, Some Stops Along the Way. I'm Mark McCord, and today we are starting in on a new country. And as a matter of fact, we are jumping into a new continent that I haven't talked about as of yet. And this episode, the country we're going to talk about in this episode is a little bit out of order as far as the trajectory of my career, but it fits squarely within the topic of, or the body of work, if you will, that we've been discussing, which is hope and hopelessness. If you have gotten a copy of my memoir, Some Stops Along the Way, you know that it is divided up into different sections. And there's a section called Hope and Hopelessness. And this particular country, or my work in this particular country, is included in that section, which is why we're going to talk about it today. The country is Cambodia. Going to Cambodia was a very different experience for me because it's one of the first projects that I did in Southeast Asia. And I quickly fell in love with the country. There are many reasons for that. I'll go into some of them a little bit later. But today, I really wanted to introduce this fascinating country to you through the eyes of someone I met there. And the story of Lee Hang, who was my interpreter and friend, is included in my memoir, Some Stops Along the Way. But I wanted to give you a little background into her story today as an introduction to Cambodia. When I arrived in country, Lee Hang is one of the first people that I met. I was picked up at the airport, taken to the hotel. A few hours later, Lee, spelled L-Y, by the way, showed up and introduced herself, and we began to work out the meeting schedule and all the details related to the work that I was going to be doing. Lee became an invaluable resource. And the first time I met her, I was struck by several things. First, her overall demeanor. She was very reserved, but not in the way of being an introvert necessarily, but reserved in a way of almost being detached. And it was off-putting in the beginning because I couldn't really get a read on her feelings, on her likes and dislikes, on her approach to the work. I was used to working with interpreters and colleagues who were very passionate about the work and very engaged and very dynamic. And Lee was really the opposite of that. Now, I found out later that certainly she had a passion for the work. She cared deeply about what we were doing. But at that first meeting, I was somewhat troubled by her demeanor. She was a very petite woman. She spoke very softly. She had eyes that would bore into you. And it wasn't that she was intimidated, because she wasn't. She made eye contact. But it was almost like the lights were on, but no one was home. And I don't mean that in the way of saying that she was not intelligent, because she was extremely intelligent, extremely learned, talented woman. What I mean by that is that when she looked at me, it was as if someone had extinguished the light that all of us have to connect, that it helps us to connect with those around us. It was almost robotic in a way, how she presented herself and how she approached our work in those early days. She would listen very carefully. She would take notes. And she made it clear that it was going to be her mission for me to implement this project at a very high level. But even in saying that, she seemed very cool and detached. I remember talking to a colleague later on that evening and saying, look, we need to have a plan B because I'm not sure that Lee's going to work out. She's talented, no doubt. She's intelligent. She can probably do the work, but I'm not sure I'm going to be comfortable working with someone who is not as passionate about this project as am I. Of course, I found out very quickly that I was mistaken in my first impression of Lee, and that she was, in fact, very passionate and very motivated. Over the coming days, Lee and I had spent a lot of time together, going to meetings, going to events. You learn a lot about a person when they're your interpreter. Because number one, you spend a lot of time with them. And second of all, you began to learn a lot about them through their approach to communicating to you in English what someone is saying in their language. I think throughout my career, and Debbie would attest to this, the people we've grown the closest to are those with whom we spent the most time and who facilitated a lot of our work, including our interpreters, our drivers, etc. And Lee was no different. Very quickly I realized that my first impression had been mistaken and that she was going to work out just fine. But even then, there seemed to be this coolness. And I realized that the coolness was not aloofness. She wasn't aloof. I finally decided that it was sadness. That her eyes were dead, but it wasn't because of the reason that I initially thought. It was because of the deep sorrow that had engulfed her spirit. And we weren't together too long before I found out the reason why sadness had engulfed her. About 10 days or so into our work, we were coming up on the weekend, and we had finished our final meeting for the week. And I told Lon that I would like to visit the Tool Sling prison in Phnom Penh, the capital of Cambodia, to learn more about that period between 1979 and 1975 rather, and 1979, when the Khmer Rouge, the communist rebels, had taken over the government under their leader, Saloth Sar, which I think is probably one of the greatest names for a dictator I've ever heard. He was called Pol Pot, but his real name was Saloth Sar. And I wanted to learn more about that period in history, the genocide that had taken place. We've all heard of the killing fields in Cambodia. We all have heard of, in some way or another, most likely, of the genocide that occurred there. But I wanted to know more. And so I asked Lee, is there a way that that I can visit this museum, and if I do, is there signage in English? Is there someone that can walk me through it and explain in English the importance of this facility to the overall period of time of the Khmer Rouge, when Cambodia was, even the name of Cambodia was changed to the People's Republic of Kampuchea. And she paused for a moment and looked at me and said, "You really want to go?" I said, "Yes, I do." And she paused a little longer and said, "I will take you." I said, "No, you don't have to do that. It's your weekend. Please don't feel obligated to do that." She said, "I will be working anyway." She said, "I often give tours of S21, and I will take you." So I agreed. And that Saturday morning, she arrived at my hotel, and we went together to the site of the Tool Sling prison, which was called S21. In the next episode, we'll talk more about the Khmer Rouge, Saloth Sar, Pol Pot, S21, and the killing fields of Cambodia during this period of 1975 to 1979. That's not the purpose of today's podcast. But that period was one of the darkest moments in the country's history. And as we approached that facility, which used to be a high school, had been a high school prior to 1975, but it was converted to a detention facility once the Khmer Rouge invaded Phnom Penh and evacuated the population of Phnom Penh to the countryside. And as we stood outside of that facility, which still had a lot of the barbed wire intact, and Lee was coordinating our entry, I got a feeling in the pit of my stomach. It hasn't happened to me many times before. It happened to me in Auschwitz. Happened to me in the Hanoi Hilton, the Central Maison Centrale, the prison in Hanoi where the American pilots were incarcerated during the Vietnam War. It happened to me a few other places. But I got this pit in my stomach as I stood outside of S21. And it's almost like a spirit of darkness was hanging there. It was a very, please pardon me, it was, pardon me again, I'm very sorry. It was a very odd and strange feeling. We walked up the walkway toward the main building, and we walked inside. It had been raining, but the sun had come out, and it was morning, and the shadows were long in front of the building itself. And the building was fairly dark inside, and so the light coming in the windows created their own kinds of shadows. So we walked in, and we began to traverse this main building of the high school, which had become this notorious S-21 prison. Lee began to walk me from room to room and talk about that period of time. And she said that in 1975, when Khmer Rouge toppled the American-backed government under Lon Nol, Lon Nol fled, and the Khmer Rouge entered Phnom Penh. She said that the Khmer Rouge philosophy was that urban dwellers and the educated were the cause of all the ills of society. They called them new people. Urban dwellers were new people. And they expelled the new people from Phnom Penh, and they sent them into the countryside to be slave laborers. So you had doctors and lawyers and college professors and their families that had lived a very nice life under Lon Nol in Phnom Penh, got sent to the fields and scattered all over the country. Families split up. Many never saw each other again. And they were forced to do slave labor as punishment for this life that they had led as urbanites. The people in the countryside were called the old people. And they had been working the fields, they were agrarian, they were farmers, they had been on the lowest rung of society, but the Khmer Rouge felt that they were the base of what the new Democratic Republic of Kampuchea would become. They were often called, rather than old people, they were called base people, because they would form the base of this new order in Kampuchea. She was explaining this to me, and I had a lot of questions. But I held back for a while and just listened to her talk. And the only way that I can liken her narrative, or the only example that I can use to give you some idea of what it was like to walk through that facility with her, would be like you ask Siri a question. In a very, very marked monotone, she gave the information in a very detached way, in a very cool way. She gave the information, she answered the questions, but I could tell that the level of sadness in her was something that I couldn't even wrap my arms around. It was as though she had detached herself from that situation, and that she was literally giving a narrative as a third-party observer. So we walked through, and I asked who and how many people were sent to S-21. And Lee said, the people that were sent here were doctors, lawyers, musicians, economists, college professors. In a random way, whatever the government officials of Lam Nol's former government, they were sent there in a very random way. Whatever the Khmer Rouge decided at the time, if they decided you were going to S-21, then you went there. And it was a horrifying place. When you arrived at S-21, she explained, you were processed in and your picture was taken. And you wrote out a confession. Typically, this confession was under duress, under torture. But once they had tortured you sufficiently and broken your will, then you wrote out a confession. And that confession was put with your intake picture. This confession would basically say that I've been an enemy of the people of Kampuchea, that I've broken the laws of this government, and that I deserve punishment. Now, the circumstances were different and in each one of them, but the commonality was just that. And they would put that in your file. And periodically, they would do more torture to get you to confess even more, and all of these things were put in your file. And for almost everyone who came to S-21, there would come a day when your usefulness was no longer a priority. They'd gotten enough information out of you, or they needed space for someone else, and you would be exterminated. And they photographed that as well. You see, the Khmer Rouge was very proud of what they did. They weren't hiding it. They didn't want to hide it from the world. They were very proud of what they did. And there was a whole room in S-21, in fact, more than one room, where we walked through, and there were just pictures of the people who had walked through those doors and never walked out. She said approximately 45,000 people were sent to S-21. And there were just a handful of known survivors. 98 to 99% of the people who arrived at S-21 were exterminated. And not quickly. Slowly, either by torture, starvation, a combination of that. And the Khmer Rouge recorded it all. And when the Khmer Rouge were ousted in 1979 by the Vietnamese army, which invaded Cambodia, and S-21 was abandoned, all these files were found and they were archived. And so the pictures are now put on display to honor the victims of S-21. And it was walking through those rooms that I got my first glimpse of why Lee was so sad. When I got my first indication of the kind of person that she was. And also when I got my first indication of, even though it had only been 10 days of us working together, how much she had started to trust me. We were the only people there. It was early in the morning, and the weather hadn't been good. The sun had just come out. And we were walking through the rooms, and I was looking through at these pictures. and she was standing by me. And at some point, she stepped back with a barred window in the background, and the sun was streaming through that window. And she was standing there in front in a white blouse and a long black skirt. And I don't know why I did it, but I took her photo. And she didn't even see me because she was looking in the other way, but I took her photo standing there in that contrast. And to this day, I don't know exactly what happened to that photo, but when it appeared on the screen of my digital camera, it was like she was an apparition. The way the sun was shining in, and the moisture that was in the air, I think everything just the nexus of that made the picture really otherworldly. It literally looked like she was a ghost. And right then and there, I looked at that picture and I said, it's the ghost of Tool Sling. And that is the title of my chapter on Cambodia in my memoir, Some Stops Along the Way. And this picture became a metaphor, really, for Lee's life. And you'll see why in just a moment. So after taking that picture, I returned my focus to those pictures of the victims of S-21. And as I was getting ready to walk into the next room, Lee did something that I'll never forget. She didn't tell me to stop or pause, but she walked up to this display case where these pictures were. And she said, "This is my father. This is my mother." She walked down a little further. "This is my two sisters. This is my oldest brother." She walked a little further. "This is my middle brother. This is my youngest sister." And she continued on until she had gone through her parents and 9 siblings. Of 10 children in her family, she's the only one that survived. And they were all exterminated in that prison. And yet, she had the wherewithal not to just give me a tour, but to give other tourists a tour of that place where her family had been destroyed. And I literally stood aghast. I didn't know what to say. But then I realized this is why she's so detached. That grief and that trauma has made her disconnect for self-preservation. Because otherwise, you would break down if you literally walked in and saw the pictures of your parents and your siblings who were destroyed in this place. And yet her voice never wavered. Her eyes never teared up. She pointed out these pictures like you would point out a beautiful tree or a bush or a butterfly. I couldn't understand it then. I still don't understand it now. But we walked through the rest of the prison, through all of the torture chambers and all of the... she unfolded this whole story of the grotesque things that had happened in this facility. And then we walked outside and we sat on a bench. By this time the sun was out, and I showed her the picture that I had taken of her. And she looked at it and said, "That's quite a nice picture. But you can't see my face. It looks like I'm a ghost." And we sat there a little bit longer. And she began to tell me her story. Over the next several hours, when we left Tuol Sleng prison and we went to one of the mass grave sites, one of the execution sites, the killing fields, they called them. We walked through that site. She told me the story of this genocide through her eyes and through her experience. And it's relayed in the book, so I won't go into detail in it other than she's the only person in her family that survived. Her father was a college professor. Her mother was a musician. And in the days when the Lon Nol government was beginning to crumble, her father, others were fleeing Phnom Penh, even leaving the country, but her father decided to stay. And he continued to go to the university, he continued to do what he could, but then the invasion of the Khmer Rouge into Phnom Penh took place. They dislodged the Lon Nol government. Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge took over. They began patrolling the streets. Lee said her mother was terrified. She'd pull the children close to her when they were going out to buy bread or vegetables, because these Khmer Rouge soldiers, most of them were illiterate. They came from the countryside. Many of them were on drugs. They would just as soon shoot you as to look at you. But her father continued to go to the university until one day when he didn't come home. And she told me they sat there that night waiting for him, and he never came. And her mother, as she did every night, went in and played the piano and sang. She said her mother sounded like the most beautiful bird that you could ever listen to when she sang. She was not only a musician, but a teacher of music, of piano and of voice. Had sang even professionally in her career, in her life. She showed me a picture of a very beautiful and learned woman. And her mother played and sang and then sent the children to bed. The next morning they arose and their father still wasn't home, and so her mother said, "I'm going to try to find where he is." And she put the older children in charge and said, "Look after everyone else." And she left the house and went to try to find father. Many hours later, she came back very disheveled, dirty. It's obvious that she'd been crying. And the children were upset and said, "Did you find father?" And she said no. But she had in fact found him at S21. And after they had abused her as much as they wanted to, they let her go for some reason. And you can read the story in the book, but the short version is that her mother was eventually taken to S21. Her siblings were rounded up and taken there. But for some reason, a Khmer Rouge officer decided that he liked her. She was just 10 years old. And sent her to live with the base people, the old people, in the countryside. She went to a re-education camp where she was taught that everything that she'd known in her life and the life that her parents lived was not only worthless, but damaging to society. And eventually, as she grew, she no longer had to work in the fields anymore because she found favor. And eventually, she was married off to another Khmer Rouge officer, a young man named Tran. And I heard this story. The end of the story is we were standing in one of the killing fields. And I said, Lee, how can you do this? How can you walk me through the facilities and the story of the worst time of your life? And not only do this for me, but do this for others on virtually a weekly basis. And in a very matter-of-fact, calm way, with no tears, no emotion, she said, what can I do but tell the truth? This happened. I can't change it. You can't change it. It happened. My family's gone. And I survived. So now I have to tell the story. The interesting thing is that she never maligned the Khmer Rouge. She never got political. She never called them killers or murderers. She simply told the story in a monochromial, monotoned way. So we went about our business over the coming days, doing our work, and as the weeks passed, the project was going very well. Lee and I continued to work very closely together, and it was coming toward the end of my time on this particular project. And Lee said, I would like you to come to dinner with my husband and I, which was a very high honor. Ordinarily, that was reserved for people that foreigners, at least, that you'd known for years. But she asked me to come, and so I did. And you can read about it in the book again. But her husband, former Khmer Rouge officer, who had gone through his own re-education after the Khmer Rouge were dislodged by the Vietnamese. He was literally one of the kindest, most soft-spoken, genuinely intelligent and interesting people that I've met. And he was very focused on Lee. He made sure that every need that she had was taken care of, from their home to what she needed to what their children needed. He made sure that her life was as good as he could make it. And it was obviously that he cared. It was obvious to me during that meal that he cared very, very deeply for her. And at one point in time, he stepped away. And I said, Tron is such a good, he seems like he's such a good man. And he really cares for you. And I'll never forget it. She looked at me. And again, in that monotone voice, said, Tron is a fool. He thinks he loves me, but I don't know what love is. I can't love him back because I'm devoid of love. I don't feel love. I don't feel anything. And I relay the rest of her words in the book. But I left that meal shaken to the core. Here was a young woman at 10 years old, had everything taken from her. She was in her mid-40s by the time I met her. And the light of her life had been extinguished. She was living as a shell of the person that she had been at 10 years old, because of the actions of a megalomaniac. And even though I still believe Tran truly loved her, he was a constant reminder of the trauma that she'd gone through. It was a wound that would never heal. And every day that she looked at him and looked at her children, it was a reminder not of how blessed she was, but of how much she lost. I don't know. I don't know how she dealt with it. I asked her one day about the trial of the Khmer Rouge. It took years to even develop a court to try the Khmer Rouge leadership. And I asked her what she thought about it. And she said it's worthless. It's over. They did what they did. Why can't we just move on? Why, at this point in time, do we need retribution and revenge? Why can't we just leave that to history and move on? It's really hard to relay in this podcast the emotions that I felt. Lee, of course, is much older now. She's still with us. Tron passed away. I hear from her every now and then. We've maintained a connection. But she made an indelible impression on me. And that's why I wanted to share her story in this first of 2 episodes about Cambodia. Because through her eyes, through her story, we can at least get a little glimpse of the kind of trauma that occurred between 1975 and 79, but also we can get a glimpse of how one deals with trauma. Everyone deals with it differently. Her way was to embrace the past and understand it and immerse herself in it. Not pretend it didn't happen. Not put all the photos of her parents and her siblings away so she never had to think about it again. But to deal with it in that very soft-spoken, calm, and monotoned way. I respected her greatly. I can never presume to understand what she had gone through. Even as she was saying it, I couldn't wrap my head around it. I still can't to this day. No one could who didn't live through it. But here's what I know. That Li Hang is a survivor. She found a way not only to survive, but to build a life. Like so many victims who survived genocides around the world have done. And you have to put what happened to her in the context of history. We've talked a lot about the wars in the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s. And those were wars, if there was a theme of those wars, it was nationalism. If there was a theme for the wars in the 1960s and 70s, it was about political ideology, communism. The Khmer Rouge were communists, and a very hard line group of communists, because the Vietnamese are who liberated Cambodia. The Vietnamese were communists too. The Khmer Rouge were even more hardline than them. So the wars in the 60s and 70s were about ideology. In the 90s, the wars, many of the wars and the genocides that took place were about nationalism. And then the wars in the 2000s, much of them centered around religion. I think it's very interesting when you look through those lenses at these different conflicts and these different genocides to understand them a little bit better. I hope my sharing the story of Lee resonated with you and helped you understand a little bit about this very beautiful, chaotic, exotic, and conflicted country of Cambodia. In our next episode, we're going to talk about this period between 1975 and 79, how it happened, who the major players were, who the Khmer Rouge were, who this man, Saloth Sar, Pol Pot, was, and how the story ultimately ended. But until then, I hope that this first episode has given you a little bit of a window into my work in the country of Cambodia through the eyes and through the story of a very amazing woman, Li Hang. I'll see you next time on some stops along the way.